Colleen Theron. I am the CEO of Ardea International, and I'm really delighted to be hosting another webinar today in our series on respecting human rights. And more than delighted to be joined by both Frank and Kate, our other expert speakers. I do want to apologize. Neither Frank nor Kate are appearing on the screen. We've been running our webinars for over 2 years now, and this is the first time we've had some kind of failure around the video. So I do want to apologize. I am going to be sharing their slides. So there will be just a little bit of a changeover between myself and Frank and Kate in doing that. Just a few housekeeping points. The webinar today is going to be recorded and we will make it available on our websites after the session. We're also going to endeavour to ask all your questions today. There is a question and answer box and a chat box, so please do make use of them, and we hope that this is going to be a really informative and also interactive session from those of you who are joining today. Just very briefly, I want to introduce you to Frank and Kate, who will both give a fuller description of who they are, introduction of who they are today. And so Frank Miller is the CEO of Track Record Global. Been excited to be working with Frank for the last more than a year now, I think, Frank, on a new due diligence service that we've been working on together. But Frank is an expert around supply chain due diligence, particularly around leather and cotton, that he's been working on for many years. And I'm equally excited to have with us Kate Wright, who is the Group Head of Sustainable Product Development at the DFS Group. And I know that she's got some very insightful points to share with you today about the work that they've been doing as a company to address supply chain risk. For those of you who are not aware of Ardea, we are a sustainability, business and human rights consultancy with specialism in modern slavery. We work internationally and across many sectors. These are just a few of our clients. And we work with business to support them in addressing their policies and their due diligence procedures. And we also do a lot of training, bespoke training, and we have a number of online resources available to support organizations with training as well and insights into these issues. So I just thought, as an introduction on my part, to give just a highlight around ESG and supply chain risk today, because I'm conscious that there might be people who are joining us who are not entirely sure of the term. So, you know, what does ESG cover? Environmental social governance. And it's a term that originated in the investment community. And actually, when I started my career, CSR was, or corporate social responsibility, was the go-to term. We've also heard of triple bottom line. We have sustainability. So there are lots of different acronyms that are used for organizations to really demonstrate how they might be addressing both their environmental and their human rights impacts. I think what's really important for us to know for today is that actually, when we're talking about ESG, there are probably a number of activities that businesses are already doing, which typically fall under the umbrella. We also, I wanted to just draw out a few things that I think have made real changes in the last few years around this agenda. And the first is that obviously the investors are far more interested in ESG, and we've seen a spike in the way that they are tackling issues in a way that I probably haven't seen in 11 years. We see, I'm seeing increasingly a visibility barrier, which what I mean by this is that there just isn't live data necessarily available to businesses on what is happening across their ESG portfolio and how they might be monitoring this, particularly below their tier 1. Alongside the kind of risk to companies for not knowing where their supply chain is and what they do is the risk in ESG related litigation that we see increasing, and also a rise in ESG regulation. So one of the ways that to tackle these issues around growing awareness of the negative impact to the environment and to human rights by businesses has been this growth in voluntary frameworks. And you may have seen the slide, I've shared it a number of times, but critically there have been a number of international frameworks which have set out certain principles and requirements for business on how they should tackle and manage their environmental and their human rights issues. And the snapshot that I've put on here are the UNGPs, the UN Global Compact, the OECD due diligence guidance, and of course the Sustainable Development Goals. But I mean, critically, what has really come to the fore is that these frameworks haven't been enough. And many companies have also tried to self-regulate how they address these issues through their own sustainability reporting, their CSR frameworks. And as a result of this sort of recognition that voluntary initiatives are not sufficient, we now see this massive growth around environmental and human rights legislation. And the EU is a good pointing point, what does that mean? It is a good starting point, is to look at what has been said recently around the proposed EU directive, which it is June 2021 that it's likely that the draft directive is going to become law. And critically, the requirement from that law is going to be that organizations can demonstrate that they undertake sufficient due diligence, and also are able to publish a due diligence strategy. Now that's a move away from the kind of reporting regulations that we are maybe more familiar with, such as the Modern Slavery Act, the non-financial reporting requirements, the Companies Act, and the various domestic reporting requirements that are at play across the globe. We've also seen, though, alongside this push around human rights due diligence legislation, a growth in regulation around conflict minerals, timber regulations, and actually the UK in its Environment Bill is mirroring some of these developments around requirements of accountability around deforestation and, of course, strengthening the Modern Slavery Act. So I think the principle there is just really for organizations to be aware of this growing requirement around legislation wanting evidence of due diligence, but also I think also understanding the scope of these regulations. So many of them are beginning to talk about value chains, and the obligation is therefore extending for business across its supply chain. It's not limited to simply what it does and how it manages its risk in its own organization. So just a few key elements around due diligence. I'm not going to keep you long because I'd like to hand over to Frank. So just critically, I think for any businesses that are engaging with what due diligence and effective due diligence means, I think a starting point is really knowing what is required, and it is an ongoing risk management process. The only point I want to raise around due diligence in relation to environment and human rights is that actually they have to be addressed by a different lens. And this is, I think, going to be part of the challenge for businesses looking at how they link their due diligence in the future, and how I think they're going to look more towards data providers and other ways of how they can actually integrate and link these particular issues. So just a few steps that a business might consider in helping mitigate its risk. I think is really critical to know where you are, what do you have in place, understand what you might require as a business, consider how you align your due diligence with international standards, particularly the UNGPs or any other environmental standards. Assess what kind of resource you need, and it has to be proportionate to your business. I think I'm often surprised at how little resource is put into these issues when you look at companies that often have billion-dollar turnovers, as this is becoming critical for reputation and for liability mitigation from a legal point of view, as well as an operational point of view. I think a board really does need to look at what is the additional resource that's required. And then I think there are questions about how you undertake your assessments, how you build your due diligence systems, and finally, how you might report on them annually. And I'm just going to leave Frank to talk about a little bit more around this, but one of the things that we're particularly excited about is Ardea has been working with Track Record Global, and we have now set up a pilot new due diligence service for addressing modern slavery and forced labor. And DFS is actually, the DFS Group is piloting this with us, so we're very excited, and that's Kate is coming to talk to us more about their program, but I think we'll touch on just why she's working with us on this. And so with that, really, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to turn over now to Frank, and hoping and praying that at some point his camera will be turned on.
I don't think anybody's missing too much, actually.
Well, we like to see your face. I do. At least if you're pulling your face at me at anything I've just said, Frank, I'd like to know.
No, at all.
Know you well enough.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thanks very much, Colleen, and thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Frank Miller. I'm the CEO of Track Record Global. I'm a forester by training. I worked for British Aid for a while, and then I worked for SGS, the Swiss inspection company, for about a decade, and I helped set up their various different certification programs like the FSC program. And then via a sort of venture-funded.com, which went the way of many .coms at the time, we set up Track Record, and that was about 15 years ago, on the basis that it was cheaper to and almost as effective to get important documents sent to us and verify those documents meant something in terms of mitigating risk, rather than actually getting on an airplane and flying to places. So essentially, we wanted to set up a program, a due diligence program that was cheap, or say cost efficient, and didn't rely on third-party audits the whole time, particularly when in so many cases third-party audits are not actually necessary. So we rely much more on self-reporting, validating that self-reporting, and although we started with timber, we now are actually involved in cotton, leather, recycled plastic, bamboo, and aluminium, recycled scrap steel, a range of different areas where people actually have, basically supply chain concerns. So next slide. So yeah, I mean, I think it's true to say that climate change is going to be the overarching driver for many different initiatives in the next several decades, and it's not going to go away. There's just going to be an explosion of government regulations around following COP26. There's going to be a sort of competition as to who can introduce the next game-changing regulation, and I think there's also an appreciation that many Western economy supply chains do have appreciable negative ESG, environmental, social, and governance impacts, and that I think that the whole climate change thing is going to produce all sorts of unknown future calamitous supply chain disruption, and the whole part of what we are trying to do is to start to shine a light on that. COVID-19, I think the Accenture, there was a recent quote from Accenture referencing the pandemic. They said, "This is a black swan event. It's making people think about balancing what they buy with global issues of sustainability." And I think that's part of what the pandemic has done. It's focused people's attention on the sustainability of the planet. And I think there was another survey recently done by Ipsos Mori, and 65% of global respondents said that it is important that climate change is prioritized in the economic recovery after coronavirus. So, this is all, in a way, the COVID-19 has provided the opportunity for significant change in the future and accelerated that. So and on top of that, then there is a desire for increasing supply chain transparency. There is increasing ENGO awareness, if you like. They are great at exposing issues that in the past have been hidden. There are and there's also a raft of sustainability claims that are appearing in the market face and are increased. There's a lot of skepticism behind those. So this has basically made the whole business of managing ESG risks important, because for instance, factories in Vietnam will probably be much more subject to flooding, disrupting the supply chain in that way. There's I think there's an estimate there's at least $500 billion available for green investment funds. There's issues like raw cotton from Xinjiang being harvested by Uyghur forced labor, and there are new regulations on coming. So all these issues mean that, as the Financial Times said, ESG is moving from the margins to the main stage. Next slide, please. There are problems with the current way that ESG is qualified. I think there's no broad agreement on terms of what ESG looks like. There's no standard assessment methodology. Each organization that's concerned with it is providing, is going in a certain way. I'm sure that will coalesce in some way in the future. The risk rating methodologies that are used at the current time, they tend to be quite top down. There's all sorts of rating agencies, different ratios that are provided. There's little sort of bottom up, and there's very little focus on supply chains. Whereas many of the risks, particularly in those supply chains that are initiated in highly regulated countries, that's where the risks lie, in the supply chain. So there is a massive opportunity for changing the way that things are done. Third-party independent audits and inspection can be extremely burdensome in terms of admin and cost. And also, it's quite difficult now to actually go on site to places because of the pandemic. So I think there are there's massive opportunities for change and improvement. Next slide, please. So track records approach is that there are sort of 3 steps to due diligence as a way of assessing ESG risk in supply chains, because that's where we think the real risks are. The first step is in terms of qualifying the inherent risk. So it's the inherent ESG risks you're trying to understand in a product or a supply chain, and trying to basically boil down what the sort of 3 or 4 main components of that are, so that you can start initially looking at supply chains and say, yes, this is a medium risk supply chain, this has medium inherent risk, or it has low inherent risk, or it has high inherent risk. And then that initial inherent risk rating has a big impact on the way that you then go out to seek to mitigate those risks. So once you've established the inherent risk rating, you then think about, okay, well, how can I basically reduce those risks? How can I offset or ameliorate those risks? What documentary evidence do I need? Well, if you've got a low inherent risk supply chain, you don't need much documentary evidence to offset the risks. If it's high, you might need evidence of a third-party audit. So that is the process. And then once you've actually gathered the mitigating evidence, then you can determine what the residual risk is. What, if you like, how much of that inherent risk have you managed to mitigate? And is that sufficient? If you haven't mitigated it all, and there's still a significant chunk left, then you've got a risky supply chain, and you need to recognize that. And maybe there's nothing that can be done to mitigate those risks. Or if you've got sufficient, even if it started off as high risk, then you might have mitigated it all and you'll be comfortable to carry on. So it provides you with a sort of systematic methodology to qualify that ESG risk and then ultimately to do something about it. Next slide, please. And part of the methodology we've developed over sort of, I guess, 15 years now is the supply chain diagram, which allows us to identify all the supply chain actors and then attach the bits of mitigating evidence to them or not, depending on whether it's available. So that allows us to visualize the supply chain and to be able to communicate with all the supply chain actors to show them exactly what mitigating evidence we require for those risks to be ameliorated. Next slide, please. So in terms of who we work with, and you know, in some of these companies we've been working for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. These are some of the biggest ones, and this is only on the due diligence stuff. So there are plenty of other clients we work with on other bits of program that we operate. Track record comes from, because we started off with the idea of collecting documentation via the internet. We're a company that's basically driven by IT, essentially. So we have a sophisticated IT setup. We have a big supplier support program, and then we have a gang of assessors who are actually assessing the mitigating evidence that comes in. So we work in about 50 different countries, sort of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 supply chains, and about 8,000 suppliers that we work with around the world. So we're regularly in contact with them all, gathering in this mitigating evidence against supply chains, against products, to work out whether or not the risk has been ameliorated or not. So we have one of our clients is in Australia. We have clients across continental Europe, and the bulk of our clients are based in the UK, but they all operate internationally. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. Essentially, you know, so I guess, where do we think, what's the future in terms of ESG performance, ESG performance assessment? I think there are rising stakeholder concerns in terms of ESG issues, whether that's the staff or shareholders or senior management or the external stakeholders as well, customers, consumers. So yeah, I think, you know, it's not an issue one can easily ignore if you've got a business. And progressive companies like the DFS Group, etc., Sofology and Dwell are actively managing those risks. And ahead of any forthcoming legislation, they are looking at a range of different issues across their supply chains. And one of those is forced labor and modern slavery. So that's a new area where we are working together and looking at using this due diligence approach to capture and, where possible, ameliorate the risks. And I think it's the many companies that we work with, the various different businesses, a lot of them are now thinking, well, okay, maybe I don't know all my ESG risks, my environmental, social, and governance risks in my supply chains yet, but in 2-3 years' time, when we've fully established the systems, then I will know what they are. And I know, and a lot of these companies know, that there is due diligence, there's regulations coming down the track. So they want to get everything prepared. And Colleen's already mentioned some of those that are out there and will be with us very shortly. And anything that goes on in the European Union at the current time will be mirrored in the UK. So there is a raft of legislation on its way. You know, because of ESG's links to climate change, things like deforestation, like the use of areas being of forests being felled for palm oil, the meat industry in Brazil, and the leather that comes off the back of that. There will be regulation in Europe and ultimately probably in the US as well that will bear down on these problems and will force big businesses to implement due diligence to show that their supply chains are not driving those climate change issues. And there will be a range of other certification programs as well. Like there's the one that we're involved with is the Responsible Steel Initiative, and the particular issue there is that we were working on is where does scrap steel come from? Because something like 50% of the raw material that goes into steel in the next 10 years will come from recycled scrap. And that massively reduces the greenhouse gas footprint of the steel sector. But people don't, the whole scrap steel supply chains are incredibly opaque. So again, due diligence will become part of that process, so that when people buy a BMW or a Mercedes-Benz or whatever, they will get to know where that steel came from, or that it was certified steel. That will be a reality in next to no time. And I think the next interesting, exciting thing is about this whole supply chain transparency process is that new technologies will absolutely be involved. That means that all the supply chain actors will be identified. So that, you know, so often in the past we've suffered with people saying, well, it's commercially confidential and all the rest of it. I'm afraid that's not going to work in the future. Supply chain actors will be known. They will be identified. And I think that there's only a limited amount of disintermediation of the supply chain that's going to take place. But big buyers want to know who the actors are. There's also the business that there will be so much more self-reporting, so much less second, third party and third party auditing will be done. And good IT allows that to be done effectively. Then there will be triangulation on that data collected, so that people will be going out to second and third party and government databases to revalidate documents that they have received. And then I think there's also interesting ways that there will be reporting going on from actually workers and actors in the supply chain. Already there are exciting programs that Colleen has been involved with, whereby workers are basically polled in terms of their conditions and so forth. So I think in the future we'll be getting away from this once every 12-month third party, second party audits to much more data being delivered by the supply chain actors about themselves and how they're doing. Right, I think that's my time up. My timer is telling me. So, okay, well, thanks very much for that opportunity. And yeah, and it's great to be working with Colleen and Kate, is all I can say.
Just to add to the text today, I'm unmuted. I was saying thank you so much, Frank. So if you just give me a second, I'll pull up Kate's slides. 1 second. I think they are here. There we are. Okay. Right, and I can see we've also got some questions, so hopefully we'll be able to get to them before the close of play at past. So Kate, over to you. Look forward to hearing you're going to be sharing with us today.
Thanks, Colleen. Could you switch on to the next slide, please? So I'm Kate Wright, I'm Group Head of Sustainable Product Development at DFS Group. So it's actually it's quite a mouthful of a title, but in a nutshell, I looked after all the product and manufacturing aspects of ESG. So the DFS Group, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a listed company. We're the UK's largest upholstery retailer and consists of 3 different brands. That's DFS, Dwell and Sofology. So the upholstery industry is rather unusual in many ways. It's actually remarkably old-fashioned. Upholstery is obviously a skilled trade where the majority of the product is actually still made by hand. There's actually a shortage of upholsterers in the UK if anyone feels like a career change. And while that might sound really attractive, the majority of the employees in the manufacturing side of this industry are still paid in piecework, which, yeah, a bit mind-blowing today. So another unusual facet is actually the footprint from the manufacturing and from the supply chains. We manufacture a substantial portion in the UK ourselves, but we also do outsource some of our manufacturing in the UK, in Europe, in China, but all of our product is made to order. So managing customer expectations around timeframes and communication of supply chains can be rather interesting. So our material supply chain is also really global. For example, timber could be sourced here in Europe, leather hides could be sourced from Brazil, textiles could be coming in from China, and then it's all manufactured and put together here in the UK. So needless to say, that adds up to quite a carbon footprint and a complex supply chain. So we've made the commitment to be net zero by 2040. And in order to achieve this, we've created something called the SOFA cycle. And it's a holistic view of our product life cycle and all the various supply chains and industries and their various nuances, all sort of mapped out for us as a framework. And this includes employment, because logistics have a very different employment structure than manufacturing, for example. And while we have legislation to ensure minimum wage here in the UK, it isn't necessarily the case everywhere else. And it's really uncommon for an employee in the UK to live on site where they work, whereas in China it's actually the norm. So we really need to build a fully transparent visual of what our supply chain manufacturing and the SOFA cycle looks like. So working with TRG on our timber and leather due diligence, we've been able to gain some of that insight needed. And it's been particularly useful during the pandemic, where they've all recently come under quite a bit of pressure. So next slide, please. So the urgency and the imperative to understand our supply chains in greater detail, particularly our social and environmental impact, has been driven by a number of different stakeholders. Firstly, we have an internal mandate from our colleagues. Everybody today wants to work for a business that aligns with their values and shares their values. So our ESG agenda has really been championed at every single level of our business, from the CEO all the way through the business, from sales, retail, even to our delivery teams. They will even attest to how they try to work on their carbon footprint. And then obviously, secondly, our shareholders and our board. Our largest shareholders have restructured their portfolios with a singular view to only invest in businesses with strong ESG strategies. So we've had to really make sure that we are staying on top of our development in ESG and continue to meet their criteria. So ESG in itself can be really disruptive for businesses. It needs to be managed with care. So due diligence and sustainable sourcing can be quite expensive and an ongoing cost, and it doesn't necessarily add value to the bottom line. And on the flip side, for our suppliers, audit fatigue is actually a very real problem, not to mention the number of different criteria we're now placing on them beyond just giving us great quality at a great price and on time. And yet, at the same time, we've got to make sure that we are addressing potential risks and we are communicating assurances of how those risks are being managed and mitigated. Next slide, please. So modern slavery due diligence, obviously a legal requirement, and is reviewed by, I'm sure, by every board. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when the Times newspaper exposed the modern slavery in the apparel manufacturing industry in Leicester, it prompted some rather interesting questions, particularly witnessing the share price drop of Boohoo, and made a few of us quite introspective on how we were trying to manage some of our risks around modern slavery. The Boohoo situation itself was actually particularly interesting because it uses a number of subcontractors which have been sort of hidden from view within an opaque operating structure, so which made it really, really difficult to identify the use of forced labour. So transparency within the business structure, not just the supply chain, has become increasingly crucial as part of business governance. So pre-pandemic, DFS Group used to manage a really strong relationship with our suppliers, which was fostered by frequent face-to-face meetings all over the world. Quite a carbon footprint again. And we would do that because we were constantly reviewing and developing new product. It's not particularly easy to sample a new sofa in the same way you might sample a new t-shirt. You can't pop it in the post. So these visits really enabled our teams to get inside and see the manufacturers, meet their teams, review their working practices, and then see them in their environments. And in effect, conduct their own form of due diligence. And on top of that, we also then have in place requirements for SMETA audits. And all of that gave us, in general, a certain amount of assurance. But what we've seen is an exponential growth within the home category, which is another outcome from the pandemic. And our supply chains, manufacturers and subcontractors have all been stretched, which has created some rather interesting dynamics. So we need a slightly different approach. Sorry, can you just move on? Sorry, Colleen, can you move on? So thanks to our ongoing timber and leather due diligence with TRG, with the methodology of questionnaires and evidentiary support, that framework was already in place. We were kicking it off really at the beginning of the pandemic, and it became really familiar with our suppliers. They were quite used to it and managing that residual risk framework, and it allowed us to have some really well-informed conversations where needed. And in addition to that, the TRG framework provided visibility and assurance for our board. So while we had modern slavery training in place for our teams and clear policies, assessing potential risks remotely, it became a bit of a challenge, and we had to address that, and we looked at this framework to help us with that. So the Ardea and TRG framework uses evidentiary support to assess certain types of risks and then minimize them. It also allows us to minimize the disruption for our suppliers without having to do on-site audits all the time. It also then through the questionnaires provides really clear guidance of our expectations for responsible management and employment, and then minimizes the investment on the flip side for expensive third-party audits on an ongoing basis, whether we pay for those or the supplier does. I think you have to just go back to that point that due diligence isn't a one-off cost. It has to be maintained over time, and it doesn't necessarily add value to the bottom line. I think we're working with our marketing teams to obviously find ways to help highlight some of the activity that we're doing so it does add value or reassurance, at least to our customer base, but it isn't necessarily something that is naturally going to add value. It could be perceived, I think, better as an insurance policy. And I have seen one of the questions pop up about ROI against ESG, and I can really sympathise. It's a challenge. So we've been working really closely with Ardea and TRG on how the modern slavery structure, the due diligence structure, should be shaped. If you just want to skip ahead, Colleen. There are nuances within every single business and within every single industry. For example, tailoring some of the language within the questionnaires has been really important in trying to reduce some of the potential risks around cultural faux pas. For example, the term on slavery is UK-centric, and could be seen as quite incendiary in certain cultures. So we've been looking at reframing this going forward as decent work as a sort of umbrella term. However, on the flip side of that, it's also really important to make sure that everyone understands that we are undertaking this work in part to make sure that we fall within UK legal requirements and how those apply to our global supply chain. So we are also undertaking the work to map our subcontractors within our supply chain, so they are seen as an extension of our manufacturers and meeting our expectations. This idea of tiers and devolving a certain amount of responsibility, I think, can be quite distracting and perhaps maybe a little bit limiting in its view, so we're trying to find ways to address that. And then, of course, we're investing in lots more training for staff and for suppliers. We'll be undertaking on-site audits as a risk to mitigate the high risk that's discovered as part of the due diligence piece. And yes, and then obviously just doing continued education. And finally, all these efforts hopefully will provide assurance and visibility for our board and for our shareholders. It is a learning curve, I've got to stress that, but it's absolutely imperative that we undertake it. So one of the biggest and most important investments we've made on this ESG journey thus far has been engagement with our suppliers, taking the time to share our vision and our mission and why our net zero target is so important and what the journey will look like to get us there. As I mentioned, the upholstery industry is a long way behind. So many of these conversations that we've had to have with our suppliers are the first time that they've ever been asked these questions. They've been asked for transparency and traceability. So really building a lot of trust with our suppliers has been absolutely invaluable. And then similarly, providing assurance to our board and our shareholders that we found cost-effective ways to assess and manage risks has been equally important. The team at TRG have really proven through timber and leather work that they did initially that they're really adept at building the relationships and the trust with our suppliers, and in turn have actually built our trust as well, because we are trusting them to act on our behalf. Obviously, supplier relationships are always really, really important to any business. And then the TRG collaboration with Ardea provides, that legal expertise to ensure the effectiveness of the audit, and that we're going to have the right evidence that we need to substantiate any due diligence support needed. And then Ardea also consulting with DFS Group. I have to admit, they are providing us with training, helping us with gap analysis, really getting to know our business and our industry so that we can really make sure we're shaping the due diligence piece effectively. So altogether, it's a lot of stakeholders that have to work together to ensure that we're tackling modern slavery and that we've got a robust due diligence framework in place. And collaboration is the absolute key to making that work. But as I said, if we can all work together, we will succeed in tackling modern slavery. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. And honestly, apologies again that we can't see you, because I like to see your faces, and I'm sure everyone here would like to as well. That was really, really helpful and insightful. I hope that for the participants, that having that first-hand discussion and insight from you as to some of the challenges and what you're doing, I'm sure is going to be invaluable. And I almost wonder that to kick off the question and answer session, Kate, if you'd like to perhaps just have a comment on the question that was raised about return of investment and making sure that, or not even making sure, but actually just comment on that return of investment point, and perhaps also, I know you've mentioned that this is seen as in some ways an insurance policy against mitigation of risk in the future, but did you want to offer something else? And then Frank, do you want to also perhaps come in on a comment in relation to that particular question?
Yeah, so I can sympathise. It is a constant conversation about how much do we invest in this area, because it can get really expensive if you try and do in-depth due diligence, but trying to balance that with what's the return on investment? Obviously, shareholders will always look for that balance and understand that we're trying to ensure that we're protecting the share price while delivering revenue. I think one of the questions that I throw back at the business, particularly around managing risk, is, well, what is the potential cost to the business if there are issues found within the supply chain, and what damage would that cause to revenue and to the share price, and then weighing up how much you really want to spend on this. I mean, I have to admit, one of the things that we particularly love about the TRG framework is it is probably one of the most cost-effective ways of managing risk. It's really smart. There is evidentiary support to be able to uphold and support any claims made, so that if anyone did want to question whether or not we've done our due diligence, we have a really clear paper trail, and it's been structured in such a way that I think actually it's not too arduous on our suppliers. It's paperwork they already have or should have in place to be able to support it. It's just making sure that it's reviewed by experts and it's, you know, valid evidence. But yes, I would go back to that piece around if you're trying to look for return on investment, the other thing you could do is really work closely with your marketing teams about how you communicate the value of what you're doing back to your customer base. Yeah, it's challenging because I think customers innately have an expectation that all this is happening, but without any real understanding of what it costs. So it's a very long-winded answer.
Thank you, Kate. Frank, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, this is formerly, maybe 5 years ago, sort of environmental issues, social issues were seen as a sort of bolt-on operation. But really, these are just new aspects of quality. The whole sort of quality envelope has broadened to incorporate environmental and social and governance issues. They're just a lot more difficult to measure. In as much you can't use any sort of technical piece of equipment to do it. You have to ask the right questions and gather the right evidence and make a judgment. I think it's also a reflection of a sort of new approach to inspection and assessment. You know, the old paradigms with the big inspection companies, I think, you know, well, that's not ever going to entirely go away. I mean, there's always a position for third-party on-the-ground audits, but I think, you know, I looked at the total revenue earned by the 3 biggest international inspection companies, and it was well over $20 billion a year. So I think there is opportunity, particularly with new IT, to change that paradigm, to massively reduce the costs, so that you put the third-party effort where the risks are highest. So I think there's lots of scope for qualifying the lower risk, the lower inherent risk operations, and then using the self-reporting to gather that information in. And lastly, I think governments have basically been pushing companies to do due diligence for a while now, and the European Timber Regulation now, and in this country, in Great Britain now, it's the UK Timber Regulation, and basically they like due diligence. They like that approach. They like, it's something that their own enforcement agencies, excuse me, can easily audit. So we're just going to see more of it. There's absolutely no doubt. Due diligence will become the methodology for governments to ensure that big companies are managing their supply chains effectively.
Thank you, Frank. And actually, I think just on the point about return of investment, you know, this has been, as Frank has said, this has been something that has actually always underpinned the issue around either environmental or human rights, modern slavery investment for companies that I've seen this for 15 years, maybe longer. And what I think is available, though, is now in the last 2 or 3 years, a lot more reports that are out there that are giving, you know, some kind of insight into what the ROI is. And I think that, you know, if you do a Google, you can go and find that. We actually, on our website, we've got a return of investment study that we did on sustainability in the sports sector about 5 years ago. So that report is available, which actually the findings of it was that, you know, the investment in ensuring that the environmental impacts, for example, were being reduced, in the end were made up by the costs in the longer term very easily. And then I think, to Kate's point, the increased requirement by a lot of new employees and actual, well, I guess current employees too, wanting to work with companies that they value is also return of investment, because the cost of replacing people is much higher than retaining people in their jobs and doing their jobs well. I just actually, there was a question that was raised about the European Union's due diligence regulation, and whether there was any kind of indication by the government of which supply chains and countries have a greater risk, or whether it will be up to each company to define that. So that's an interesting question that's been asked. So two things. I think, first of all, we've got a slight distinction in that obviously the UK is no longer part of the EU, so there will be no requirement on it to adopt the proposed directive if it goes through in 2020. I have, however, heard from various forums that the UK is very keen to ensure that there's a level playing field, and actually that it is seen as a leader around sort of ethical supply chain. So I'm sure that similar standards and regulation will be put in place. There's not going to be, as such, as far as I know, you know, guidance to that degree that will come out with the proposed directive. I think that it's going to be up to companies to do this assessment around their inherent risk, both for environment and for human rights in the first instance, and then to follow up and to monitor on that. I do know that more work is being done around sector focuses, a lot more. I think we're going to see more publications around that to help businesses, and of course, you know, using data and toolkits and different ways of assessing where that risk is going to be is, I think, for companies perhaps going to be more useful than what was there, you know, 5 or 6 years ago. Frank or Kate, do you want to make a comment at all around, you know, what you're seeing, perhaps Frank, around the timber or leather due diligence regs and that sort of assessment on country risk supply chains?
Yeah. Okay. I'll go first, Kate, then.
Yeah.
If that's okay with you. I think, yeah, the governments are never going to specify, although governments are going to say that companies have to do due diligence, and there's going to be a lot more of it. That's for definite. There's a DEFRA law coming out in a couple of years' time, or probably maybe 18 months' time, where they're going to be looking at, they're going to ask big companies to look at the impacts across a broad range of different commodities in terms of deforestation. They're never going to specify what should exactly be the ingredients in a due diligence program in terms of how you rate risk. What they will specify the sort of things that you should be looking at. They'll talk about the process, just like, and this is a situation with the European timber regulation, but they don't say exactly what indexes you should be using. A lot of it is relatively common sense in terms of there's an awful lot of risk is around about regulatory capacity. What is a country's regulatory capacity to make sure things are done properly? Many countries have great regulations. Many countries lack the regulatory capacity or will or whatever to make those regulations work. So those are the sort of risks. And then for timber as well, you know, as an example, for timber, we use Corruption Perception Index, another couple of other indexes as well. Issues like species, biodiversity, high conservation areas of forest, etc., to work out what the inherent risk is. And then this, with cotton, there's another set of indexes, or there's some crossover, and with leather the same, and so forth. So there is a degree of commonality, but also then you get down to the specifics for that specific type of supply chain. Kate.
So I would actually say that we're not necessarily looking at what the governments are asking for specifically. We are trying to find a combination of our own due diligence, but we're looking for certification to support within certain industries. So within timber, we are specifying that all of our supply chains need to be fully FSC certified. And naturally within FSC, there are certain types of timber that they deem as a high risk and won't accept. They are more deeply embedded in certain countries where it's easier to do sustainable sourcing. So by natural sort of selection, you'll end up with I guess a supply chain which has a certain amount of protection in terms of where you're sourcing from. We've also put in place the same framework for leather and for textiles, in part because those certifications provide value back into the value chain for our suppliers, rather than relying on what one particular government, in our case the UK, says. So if we're dealing with global manufacturers who have got global customers, we want to make sure that what we're asking for and the work that we're asking them to do is actually adding value for their business for all their customers. As I mentioned, audit fatigue is a problem. So let them have a framework that will aid them for all their different customers. So it's a slightly different perspective, I guess, rather than working on with just what the government is asking for, looking at very specific tailored solutions based on materials or industries.
Yes, thank you, Kate. And I guess actually, you know, on the point about doing something outside of what the governments are doing, that's practical too, because of course we see different standards across the globe being set by governments. So it makes better sense as a business to determine what your standard is and then try and work out how you apply that.
Yeah,
I mean, I think sorry, Kate, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think that's really fair, actually. The nuances within different countries can place a few different criteria for your suppliers. So trying to find a global framework that works across an entire supply base when it's very mixed is rather challenging. I think is probably the right way to put it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in the forced labor and modern slavery due diligence that we're doing, there's a range of different laws and requirements that we've looked at and included.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. That's absolutely right. I mean, we've tried to develop it along all the key principles that we've seen in the due diligence and the reporting framework, so that we pulled out the really, you know, critical principle pieces. Wow, we've come to the end of an hour. It's been fantastic having Frank and Kate on. I apologize again that we haven't been able to see their smiley faces, which I'm sorry for, but I hope that you've all found today really helpful, and we certainly will make the webinar available, and we are running another webinar in June on child labour. I'm sure we won't have the same tech issues, but I want to wish you all well, and thank you again, Frank and Kate, for giving up your time and sharing your expertise with us today. It was a real pleasure. So thank you and goodbye, everybody.
My pleasure.